Good evening, everyone. This is Lori Charlton. It's February 6th, 2025. Welcome to the regular meeting of the Board of Finance Fund Balance, Borrowing, and Debt Service Subcommittee. I'll call the meeting to order and ask that we please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. To the members of the public who've dialed in or joined us on Zoom tonight, you are muted and will not be heard by subcommittee members, and there will be no live public comment this evening. Members of the public are encouraged to send their comments and questions in writing to the subcommittee members, which include me, my colleague Craig Curley, and Amy Ruggiero. You can contact us through the Board of Finance page on the town website. On that page, there is a link on the left-hand side that gives an option to contact the board or contact individual board members. That will bring up a form where residents can input their name and address and include their comments and add an attachment if they wish. So we'll move right into item 3, which is to hear and discuss the WPCA long-term capital and financial plan. This was a plan that was initially introduced to us at our last meeting. It was a first pass of a draft plan. This is the second pass, which is still in draft form and subject to further revision and review and approval by the WPCA Commission. But we at our last meeting, we had a number of questions and comments, which I believe have been incorporated into this package. And I will turn it over to Michelle Bohr, David Becker, Tom Harris, whoever's going to walk us through this.
Sure, and thanks, Lori. And I'll start off, and I'm going to go down the list of feedback that was received at the January 9th meeting, and I'll go in the order
Great.
that I received those comments. So I'd like to start with item number 1 of the feedback. Break out the 10% revenue increase in the projections to show impact on consumption versus rate increases. So if we go to page 8, so in the schedule here, the financial plan. You'll see the notes here at the bottom, which speak about how the breakdown was performed. So based on the analysis of the averages, the revenue grew at least 20%, which we saw at the last meeting. And then the finance department has broken this down further based on an 18.73% growth rate. It's growth, which is about 13.5%, and 5.22% of the consumption growth. And that was based on 2020 through 2024. So we had 5 years. Last meeting, we were utilizing 3 years of data. So we received the additional 2 years of data, and they actually did perform the breakout.
Can we ask questions as we go on?
Sure. Yeah. And just one caveat to all this, I'm an environmental engineer and a compliance manager. I'm not a finance expert, so I'll do the best I can this evening.
Please, we've been trying to get a plan constructed for 3 years. So, and I know Sabrina did a lot of work on this too. So thank you all.
Yeah.
We're thrilled to just have it in front of us. So that's the historical information. And then so taking that history, the numbers that were incorporated into the current year plan, is that what I'm seeing on page 4? No, I'm sorry. It wasn't page 4. It was, where was it? I saw it when I was reviewing page 3. So if I'm reading this correctly, it looked like we have the calculated rate so that we have a consumption increase at 5.7 that was used, and then a calculated rate increase. So the rate increase, would that be in this scenario they proposed?
Right.
Okay,
correct.
Yes.
And these are per annum, right? So
Right.
12%, which you still, okay.
And that's concerning for the WPCA.
Yeah. And we could talk about this as we go along. I did notice though, and Amy and Craig, obviously dive in here, but, this does show, if we use these rate increases, that we build up the fund balance rather significantly. I think that was on page 2.
Right.
So I'm gonna assume that wasn't the intent to drive up the fund balance to $30 million. So I'm assuming that if we change the assumptions to use some of this fund balance, that could take the rate increases down.
Correct.
Okay.
So one of the suggestions is to take part of the fund balance and use it towards rate stabilization, create a rate stabilization fund.
Yeah. Okay,
We haven't done that in this model here.
right. Okay. And that would be, and so the commission would want to have some input on that, right?
Yeah,
So you would want to leave some level of fund balance, obviously for emergencies, but you could, okay.
exactly. And then that's worked into the draft funding policy, as you'll see later in the discussion.
You may also want to mention that you have costs that are not like the selection costs.
We could get to that now. I
Well,
was gonna get to
go ahead.
that later on. Yeah, so we'll get to that later on. I know
Okay.
last meeting, we talked about some costs that hadn't been previously identified.
So just in terms of the rate increases though, so one mitigating factor can be the use of the fund balance, which makes sense. And then presumably another one could be the timing of the capital projects. If that
Exactly.
changes, will change the debt service costs, right?
Yep.
There's a few different pieces too, because right now you're projecting to increase the fund balance over time versus no longer increasing, but actually draining, sort of
Right.
slowly bleeding off, but keeping at some base
Yeah.
level for emergencies. So, so one of them isn't building it. The next is actually taking some out. And then the other piece is we get to, we talk about the projects, but actually the timing of the projects. So there's a number of, we always talk about sort of looking at the worst case sort of scenario, adding in as many layers of conservatism and then walking our way back. We try to do that. And then, yeah, Michelle has some points to talk about as to, areas of caution.
I don't mean to interrupt you guys, but if you hear that, like the vents or the heat, whatever blowing, just talk a little bit louder because that's gonna be closer to the mics.
Okay.
Okay.
And can I, I just want to level set this before we go on. So the purpose of one of the main purposes of the analyses was to ensure that we all understood how much debt service could be absorbed within this entity and have it remain self-sustaining. So to the extent we make changes to this model going forward, is it fair to say that items would change within the kind of the income statement model? So we potentially adjust rates down, use fund balance, et cetera, but we, change debt service if projects are spread out, but we would be aiming to keep the level of projects funded by the WPCA intact here, right? Like, in other words, we wouldn't be making changes here that would cause more debt service to have to spill over to the town, right?
Correct. So this is based off of the draft breakdown that's in the proposed funding policy.
Yeah, okay, okay. Okay.
I think that from this point forward, although all of these are at some level of in breathing documents, we're
Right.
trying to start to move to a point that there's some things that guide why we're doing what we're doing. We'll know pretty quickly if they're, if those are, or, good decisions or not, but everything from here should start to kind of go hand in.
And is there, and I want to give my colleagues a chance, but last question on the rates, is there a targeted rate that we're going to be trying to get to based on benchmarking or based on history or?
Right, so we definitely want to get into single digits. And a typical rate increase would be like 5 or 6%.
Okay. Just based on our history, you mean?
But our history has been lower than that. Our history has been more so 3 to 4%
Mhm.
increase. We have had some spikes in certain years. A couple of years ago, I think we had an 8% increase. But when you look at WPCs overall within Connecticut, it's typically around 5 or 6 years.
Okay, thank you.
And,
Sure.
and Michelle is working on, a rate study, and that
So
also
we're seeking
has.
professional services, specifically a cost of service study. And I'm engaging with 3 different consulting firms who specialize in this area of expertise. That's going to help us incredibly when it comes to not only being able to better understand the factors that are contributing to our rates and how we can alter those conditions to ensure our rates are more within the range that we would expect. But it will also help us with the scheduling in our capital plan as well.
Thank you. Amy or Craig, do you have anything before Michelle moves on?
I'll defer to Amy first.
We can't hear
We
you.
cannot hear you yet, Amy. Oh, I'll go while you're trying to get your audio set up. So thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for this. I know there's a lot of work that goes into this and we don't take it for granted. So thank you for all your effort and thanks Sabrina as well. But I too was kind of focused on, I was trying to understand and reconcile pages 2 and 3. And, you know, page 2 kind of shows this fund balance growing to a pretty large number. And page 3 kind of backs into or solves for the rate increase of, call it 12%. And I would have thought that, like, I mean, it's algebra, right? So I would have thought that, and maybe I'm missing something, so maybe that I can phrase this in the form of a question like Jeopardy. But I would have thought that that 5% or somewhere between 5 and 10% rate increase would be achievable without getting these large fund balances, and you don't have to mess with the timing on these projects.
So, couple of things. So one, on the town side, when you get to the capital plan, we are probably you're gonna see that in all reality, while we stay preview under 9%, but we're probably going to have to, if the town is paying these projects, like many items in all reality are gonna have to get cascaded out a bit. So some of that is going to just simply occur for both, and it's also a capacity,
Operational
even getting it
capacity.
done, operational to some extent, even on the project side and really getting these things out. But the town is gonna be a piece of that. So I think the other part is the way that Sabrina and so correct me on some of this if necessary, but Sabrina, you look at a lot of averages of things. So if we were to start to project out on consumption, we know that a substantial portion of users that possibly exceed these factors come in, but we're utilizing averages. We're looking at the fact that part of what's happened is we budget for in the past, there's been a budgeted amount, but that number there's a number of factors that have caused that number to go up each year. So a lot of this is averaging and applying it in. So the next phase is going to be drilling down at better projecting, better looking at those rates. One of the things, in the cost study analysis that Michelle's working on, also like that things that we don't know yet, but we believe that there's, as has been typical in this organization, there's a number of areas that don't go straight to the rate or the tax rate. They go to fees. They're a little more equitably distributed. So those types of items, as you look at the next few iterations of this, are going to bring those things in focus. So there's a lot of averaging, knowing that we're probably going to exceed in a number of areas, and then sort of starting with your worst case and then trying to work, backwards from there. So obviously there's a lot of work that's gone on in this. I know that, we've really been trying to meet the subcommittee and the board's timeline. We really need to meet that timeline and enough of a capacity to come and ask for projects, starting frankly in a few weeks from now to meet other objectives. So, that's part of kind of why we're where we are now and looking forward to the next steps, and we can
Right.
update on whatever schedule is necessary.
Okay.
If you get this, and it sounds like we I'm not sure if we did or we didn't, but sort of worked backwards here a little bit. But if we were to take maybe a different approach and say, we want to drive toward a rate increase that's consistent with the study you do or consistent with some number, you know, and we plug that in. And then see what that does to us and say, okay, in order to achieve that, I'm gonna have to use $1 million of fund balance a year, or, you know, my debt service will have to be adjusted by this. Is that like the intent for the next version? So, because I mean, obviously, this has to end up with a reasonable rate plan so that hopefully the commission will then use this as a guide when they're making their decisions about.
That's the goal.
Correct.
Yeah.
And we have a little bit of time, obviously,
Yeah.
until the commission, you know, sets that. So we're hoping to clear some unknowns on the expense side, sludge being, you know, one big one. And then over the next few months, work through the capital plan further, and that gives time to work. through.
Because we have funding sources like David alluded to that we haven't tapped into in the past.
You mean like grants and things?
Well-
No, so I'm talking about costs to our customer base. So benefit assessments, that's something that WPCA's utilize when there's significant capital projects. Those are durational, so there's not forever, those types of charges. There's also surcharges for concentration and types of discharges. We haven't utilized that either. That's very common. So there's things that we could look into that, you know, it would be generating like significant revenue sources that we haven't utilized in the past.
And
Yeah.
one thing to just to note is that the plans, you know, there's obviously basic inflationary pieces, wages, costs, et cetera. But one thing here as we work on our I&I that we can factor in is that the plant is running at a certain level of a capacity at this point, that as I&I is reduced, as consumption, you know, goes up, it won't work in a perfect, you know, parallel, but it will over time sort of create an offset there. So we're not looking at necessarily anymore having to build up the plant as much. We're not necessarily looking at, you know, some of these operating items spiking because consumption is going up. We're just gonna make a concerted effort to bring I&I down and do things like that. So there's a lot more analysis and, you know, and I remind everybody, Michelle, you know, Sabrina's only been working on this analysis for really a few months. And Michelle hasn't been on for more than a few months herself. So we've made a lot of progress, and I give frankly the two of them, you know, there's others, but
We've
you know,
done
a
deep.
significant.
Yeah, no, again,
we really did a
we've
lot
been
of-
trying to get this for
So-
3 years,
So if we're at
so
12
this is,
points and
yeah, we're
able to
happy.
walk backwards, like
Yeah.
worst case
But
scenario,
something's
that's
so
it.
needed, and
Yeah,
so
no, it is.
much appreciated that this request came in
Yeah.
at this time, because this is really a basic necessity of any WPCA.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, and I'm glad the rate study is happening and that there'll be an analysis of the different types of funding sources. I think the key, and the gut feeling is that we can get these rates down to, you know, a reasonable and a level that's, you know, at least benchmark to other communities. But I think the most critical thing to know as we move into the broader capital plan is that even in doing that and getting the rates down to a reasonable level, we still anticipate that the debt services or the projects that have to be absorbed by the entity can be paid for by the entity. Like, we're not gonna end up with changes that cause more debt to go onto the town side. And that was the biggest thing, because we all know the first version of the town capital plan, it was sort of a wild guess. We put everything here for 5 years and then we
Yeah.
put everything over to the town, and we had no idea what that was really gonna look like. So that the fact that we've got the policy is helpful. Okay.
Can I ask a
Yes.
follow-up? Yeah. So just looking back to that second page of the analysis where it does show the growing fund balance. Obviously, the larger that is, the healthier that is. It can absorb, you know, surprises and be used for surprises or otherwise. But has there been any discussion about what either this group or the WPCA feels is an appropriate fund
threshold,
balance?
like a threshold.
Yeah, like is there a?
Threshold. So we get to that in the funding policy.
Okay.
And it's really taken off of what typical thresholds are. So the typical range would be 15 to 20%. And that's really to
Of
absorb.
annual
Yes,
expenditures, yeah.
exactly. And that's really to absorb the, emergency projects, emergency needs that come up. It's also to utilize towards rate stabilization fund as needed.
But this fund balance is not 15 to 20% of the projected expenses on an annual basis. It's, 8 to 10 times that, right? So,
Yeah, so I mean, I'm assuming that what that will mean is that will be, that differential is gonna go to reduce the rate.
yeah.
Yeah.
Would have to, I
Yeah.
would think. But even if, given the size of the cost of some of your projects, right, they can be big, lumpy, big dollar amounts. They don't happen all the time, but they're just big. So I would think that a fund balance of one times annual expenses might be more appropriate than 10 to 15%. But I mean, I'm not the expert. I'll defer to you guys as to what's appropriate and what others do, but I would think that one, this number can come down, but it doesn't have to come down as far as what you might suggest in the.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that this is just my gut reaction to what you said.
Mhm.
I would be more inclined to want to see something like that if we didn't have confidence in the capital plan, which we have not had previously. I
Yeah.
think our level of confidence in the capital plan and knowing what's in front of us, there's always going to be some surprises.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't get a $30 million project surprise. If we have a surprise like that would require substantial fund balance, then that, I think the whole point of this hopefully is to make sure it's comprehensive. And then, we might have a surprise where you have like the equivalent of a digester thing or something like that, which you needed, $500,000 or $1 million or something, but a major capital project should be in the plan.
Yeah,
So-
and I was thinking more in terms of as these projects get whittled off, the fund balance can come down, right? Because now there's more predictability, right? There's less out there. And I was thinking more in terms of not so much a new unforeseen project, but the cost of a project on the list costs
Yes.
more than anticipated.
Yeah, that's a
And we're
really
doing, and we're doing better when it comes to those cost projections.
yeah.
And getting updated projections. And it's something that we should be seeking on an annual basis anyways.
And the other thing too, to Mr. Curley's point is that to the extent we use the fund balance, that would come down over time. So I
Yeah.
think there's gonna be,
Right.
a period, there's gonna be a number of years where it is just naturally higher than the target because you're not gonna want to use it all at once for a capital project. Like the notion of a rate stabilization fund, which is really just kind of an offset to your debt service. It's using it for your debt service.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of
Makes
sense.
sense.
Okay.
Okay. Great. Looks like we lost Amy.
Yeah,
Comment too.
yeah. So comment to,
Can you guys hear me?
yes, now we can.
But we cannot.
Okay. I tried talking before and I sent you something, Lori, because it said that the host wasn't allowing people on the phone to unmute themselves.
Oh, let me,
She should be.
So I don't know, it's now working, so I don't know if somebody turned something off. But I have 3 screens going, and when I put my camera on it, I can't move my
know if
mouse,
you-
so I have no idea.
you texted-
Do you think that everything like this right here, we have, when you were talking about other towns with WPCAs, do we have any other towns that operate very similar to us that we could do some comps off of to see if this is in line?
We do. Greenwich is very similar to us. We could look at Norwalk as well. I've also been looking at, some regional WPCAs as well, just because of the robust capital plans that they have in place. That's something that it is on the agenda for WPCA's new project manager and myself. We're looking to put together a matrix, where we could really, we'll really be able to compare our breakdowns when it comes to town funded versus WPCA funded for the projects, as well as what minimum thresholds are in a fund balance. So we're working on that now.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. And I guess I'm making an assumption, but I guess for other towns to share information, you could probably get it on their sites and stuff just to compare it and speak to your counterparts there to share knowledge.
Sure. For sure. And we've been doing that. Yep.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, so it looks like we covered number 2. You showed us the revenue data. So number 3 was the contingency related to the sludge issue that we talked about last time. And how that impacts expenses and to what extent that's reflected in this update.
Right, and so that is actually not reflected in this update. This doesn't pull from that most recent change. I am still waiting for accurate quotes from disposal vendors. I'll be receiving those within the next week to 2 weeks. The slowdown on that was really the additional analytical data that those outlets needed from the WPCF. And so the turnaround time at the lab was 2 to 3 weeks. So we didn't receive that data until early last week. But I do know just verbal cost estimates that I've been receiving from vendors. I took the average of the range is about $900,000. So this is the estimate that we discussed last month.
And that's annual.
That's annual. Coming out of our operating budget.
Okay, so that might eat it, so that obviously would eat up some of this fund balance on its own. Okay. All right, and then we had the debt service related to the East Trunk line. Was that taken out of here?
That was.
Okay.
Yep.
And then 5 is the funding policy, which is our next agenda item. So we'll get to that. The balance sheet impact of the long-term plan. We talked about that. You went through the report of the fund balance. Number 7, this was, which the question was add comments on historical data to explain large variations. And ensure any fluctuations were properly considered in developing the projections. I think this question arose from Ms. Ruggiero's, a question she had the last time, and I don't remember which fluctuations we were looking at, but are there?
So we added comments to each line item of the budget.
And where are they?
And that starts on page 5. Under explanation.
Got it.
Okay. We didn't highlight any specific object in the budget.
So as a result of putting together these explanations and looking at what caused the variations, did that cause you to change any of the assumptions in the model or not?
Can't answer that question. That would be a question for Sabrina.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, just I'm reading some of them and they seem like that, there's reasons for them that they may be one-time items, but they wouldn't necessarily change your assumption going forward. So, but I think somebody should just make sure.
Yeah, and she's also just on the budget side, she's also spent a fair amount of time since taking this on. And going through and sort of reclassifying a lot of expenses, and be it project or operational, there were a number of different
Inconsistent classifications, you mean, or?
yeah, and
We had
and
asked for the cleanup and there is
Yeah.
significant, there's a
so
lot of
I
cleanup
went
that
to
needs
go
be
do an
done.
approval and didn't seem quite, it didn't line up, and next thing you know, it's coming over going, wait a minute, no, that doesn't. And then we looked at something to compare it and it didn't quite look like it was like booked in the right project or budget, and there were just things like that, nothing wrong with them, but more again, like inconsistencies in how they're being classified. And that does have an impact.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly if they're classified as expense and they should be a project. And then also in forecasting if there's an issue there. So Sabrina has worked to shore up current year and then in her projections, certainly is trying to identify, we're not gonna go back and change, but certainly you wanna make sure that you're projecting, as you model out correctly. So that was a significant amount of time, but it sort of stumbled into it. Partially with this was good timing, but also just.
Well, yeah, and that should
So-
help for the budget too. I mean, and is there, what's the process right now? Like when invoices are getting coded or whatever to get paid, who reviews that classification currently?
So. Come out of the WPTA.
Yep, and so there's redundancy in the WPCF. It's reviewed by the superintendent, it's reviewed by myself, then it's reviewed by David.
Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, so just,
There's a number of steps that we're trying to put in place.
Got it.
and ensure
yeah, and
that-
that's what I was just gonna, because
Yeah.
you're right. I mean, if stuff gets misclassified, it's okay for the bottom line, but then it's
Yeah.
gonna impact you in terms of getting good data. to look at for budget
Yeah, and these
purposes.
were historical, so there are 3 projects in particular that needed this cleanup. It was the secondary digester, it was our pump stations. And it was Turney Creek site.
Okay. Okay, and then, so that was 7 and 8, so those are the questions, so it sounds like so the items that are open still are to just update rates when you have all the data and determine the impact on fund balance. Include the impact of the sludge expenses. And is there anything else? That's great. Those are the big items. All right, well, yeah, it's still a lot of progress. It's good to see that, it's good to know that I guess my reaction to this overall is that I was a little surprised, pleasantly surprised. I thought we would have more spillover into the town's capital plan. I didn't think, when we were getting these back of the envelope analyses, I didn't think any of us anticipated that this entity would be able to absorb most of its project costs. So that's good. Okay. Any other questions?
Not for me.
For item 3? Okay. So we can move on to item 4, which is to hear and discuss management's recommended funding policy for the WPCA capital projects. And there is I don't think this is posted because it's in draft form, not approved by the commission, but we're going to discuss it. And for the benefit of the public, this gets to the funding policy means the split of financing of these projects between the town and the WPCA, which each have 2 discrete sets of taxpayers. And so given that we have a lot of projects coming up, this was important so that we are not making ad hoc decisions when these projects come before us for approval, and we have a framework that ultimately can get approved and be memorialized in an MOA or other form of legal document. So we have the draft here. And Michelle, do you want to walk us through it?
Sure, and I'll walk through the major highlights of the policy, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So to begin, I'd like to just bring us all to section 4.0 of the policy. This is where the percentage breakdowns are discussed, but this also discusses certain factors. So each one of WPCA's projects are specific projects, but also the classification of our projects should be considered based on the factors of what's the complexity of the project, what is the financial health of both of our funding partners, what is the priority of the project when it comes to the community? Is it to support economic development? Is it something that the WPCA needs to take on to mitigate risks? So for example, compliance costs, and then also consideration of what the post-construction life cycle costs are of the project. So these are some of the big factors to consider, and these will have to be considered prior to applying the breakdowns that are identified in this project to any project before seeking the funding allocation. So looking at the breakdown was identified by project classification and also by project type. There's three major buckets here, the first being plant upgrades and community impact assessments. This is an area where it's very specific to WPCA needs, the specific ownership that WPCA has over its plant and its collection and conveyance system are all reasons why WPCA is earmarked for 75% of the funding, with the town contributing 25%. The specific project types are any type of non-routine infrastructure rehabilitation or replacement to the plant itself. So this would be inclusive of our phase 1, 2, and 3 plant upgrades, non-routine operational enhancements to our facility. So these are things not necessarily if we're looking at one piece of equipment, we think that it would be a better value to us if we replace it, if we modernize it. It wouldn't be that as an enhancement, but it would be something related to, as an example, energy efficiency comes to mind as a project that benefits not only WPCA, but the community at large. And then also certain technical studies. One example of this is the facility is built on a solid waste landfill. So we do know there's known contamination at the site. It would be an environmental risk assessment and cleanup of that contamination would fall under this category. Also, an economic impact study of the operations at the facility. Any type of climate resiliency projects would also fall in this category, as well as sustainability of the system at large moving forward, just because it is a major piece of our utility infrastructure.
And David, you might have the history on this. This is before my time, but I thought that last time we had plant upgrades, they were paid by the town. Am I wrong about that? I mean, not to say that this couldn't be the policy. I'm just curious how we,
100% paid by the town?
what's that?
100%?
I don't know. I thought that when we were batting this around, we had at the full Board of Finance, there were a few people, I know Jim Walsh, maybe it was Ed Bateson too, when we did this at a capital planning workshop. And I thought the discussion was that last time we did a major plant upgrade, which is for,
Like 2000.
yeah, I thought that the town,
Predated my time, but that was always my understanding.
okay, it might be,
You can go back. and
yeah, it might
confirm
be, and that doesn't
Right.
mean that we shouldn't change it, but that struck me, and also the environmental piece. If we do have environmental contamination that we have to deal with, I could see a scenario where that could easily outstrip the WPCA's ability to pay for it.
Right.
I mean, if we had something,
Great.
so those might be, and obviously if a policy is a policy. You could always word a policy similar to our fund balance policy, like these are the guiding principles. But if you have something extraordinary,
I'm happy to hear you say that.
Yeah.
Because there is a need for flexibility in a
Yeah.
policy
Right.
such as this, and WPCA's have this type of policy. They typically revisit this policy on an annual basis as part of their pre-budget process.
yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Well,
like I almost want to I don't want to introduce any bad karma here, but yeah, suppose you figured out that there was some, $50 million contamination issue you had to deal with, like that couldn't
Oh, we
be.
do.
And I think,
We have
it's the
our
need for the
models that exist.
flexibility, and it's why my prelude to this section 4, it was talking about evaluating these factors on case by case basis for each project before we apply these funding breakdowns.
I think that's right. And I think maybe, and I think there might be wording in the fund balance, one of the other policies that this committee looked at, I remember that it was careful to clarify or say that this was guidance or something.
Yeah, not
versus-
binding,
Yeah.
it's a guideline.
Yeah, I mean, it's a guideline that we will follow, but it's not like we're breaking a policy. If we don't like it, there's room for to take into account some unusual circumstance. So maybe just, clarifying that here would be good. But it would be good. Again, I don't have a problem with this per se, but I think it might be helpful to understand the history, even if it's going back a while. If it was 25 years ago that we last did this, I'm not sure that counts as, I'm not sure the precedent is really relevant, but it would be good to know. All right, and then the second category,
And the second category, similar to the East Trunk Line and how that played out, is projects necessary to support economic development within town and increase capacity not only of the plant itself, but of our entire sewage system. And that's where you see really the infrastructure extension and expansion projects, or the projects types
Yeah.
that are identified under this classification. Also non-routine infrastructure rehabilitation to our pump stations. And so we have 7 of our 8 pump stations that are identified on our capital plan now for either full replacement or rehabilitation. There are 4 of those pump stations have to be rebuilt. One, because they need to meet current resiliency requirements from FEMA. Those are projects that WPCA would share ownership in with the town, I would think on at least a 50-50 basis. The remaining 3 pump stations do not have those types of requirements. And although those would be rehabilitations, they're routine in nature.
Right.
They've met their end of life.
It's maintenance, yeah.
It's maintenance. Those were expected to incur those types of costs.
okay? And that would be like the third category, which is the routine maintenance, 100%.
Correct. And so this is a category that I was encouraged to include just from internal discussions within the town. This is a category I hadn't previously thought about carving out in this policy, to be totally honest. But I do see that there is a need for it. It's the routine maintenance. It's operational enhancements that do not have a broader community impact. It's technical studies outside of facility planning, which works hand in hand with plans of community development. And I give examples. And so the appendix to this policy, as you've seen, there are specific examples of actual projects that would fall within each one of these project types.
I'm not sure if
It's an appendix, attachment A. Policy.
oh, here it is.
Yeah.
Okay, that's right. Yeah, got it.
So when I say things like routine and non-routine, rehab and replacement, there's a list of the specific project types that fall under that category. The same thing with operational enhancements and technical studies.
Yeah, no, excellent. I mean, because there could be a lot of interpretation. I appreciate
Right.
the specific, the descriptions of what would fall under each category. That's very helpful.
Michelle, are there chances, I mean, this is a comprehensive list in this appendix and the detail helps. Is it possible though that a project could kind of fall into multiple crossover, right?
It could.
So,
It could. We were having discussions about that
Yeah.
internally before tonight's meeting as
Right.
well. As I said, my initial run through, my initial draft of this policy did include certain projects under multiple project classifications, because that's very much true. And again, I think that just underlines the need for flexibility
Yeah.
in a
Agreed.
policy like this.
Yeah.
so, what jumps out to me, is it okay? if I-
Oh, of course.
Sorry. What jumps out to me is exactly that, flexibility. When I see the word policy, it's much more strict.
Yeah.
I prefer guidelines.
Yeah.
I think you can probably add some language in here that to the extent that there's any factors, like, it's gonna be subject to mutual agreement by both the town and the WPCA to discuss or decide in advance, right? Like, no project should go forward in ambiguity. But yeah, I mean, I think on a case by case basis, you can say, yeah, this project does fall into a couple of different things, or our fund balance is lower than we anticipated, or it's higher than we
Yeah.
anticipated. So let's come up with a
Yeah.
split that you don't want to have to negotiate every project, but you need some flexibility to say, maybe this is a 2/3, 1/3 split, and let's just get it behind us,
Yeah, I like the idea of guidelines. The way I think about guidelines is that you expect the guidelines to be followed. And then if you're not going to be within a guideline, either because it's ambiguous or because there's another circumstance, then there's a conversation about it.
Right, exceptions.
Right, and that exception is discussed so that everybody understands and agrees with what it is, but, under normal circumstances, you follow the guidelines.
And then along those lines, if the document has that flexibility, my question is this a legally binding item that the town and the WPCA would sign off on? Is it a memo of understanding? Like, how does this actually get put into effect?
We talked about that a little bit at the beginning. Our first meeting, the town attorney was with us, and I think you might have brought it up. I mean, we have an MOU that goes along with each bond request. But we talked about having an MOU that outlines this agreement, and
That would save
yeah.
a lot of time in the long run, I would
yeah,
think.
and so I think, and I'm not sure if that means we don't have to have an MOU for each project, but I think we should, as this becomes, it would probably be a good idea, and that's a really good point. It would probably be a good idea to get some guidance from Phil.
Yeah.
If this is going to be memorialized in an MOU, which I think is what we all anticipated, does that impact how, squishy the language can be, or,
We can follow with Phil
Yeah.
on this. I mean, the two boards adopting maybe a similar fashion.
right,
You want to go through, then also adding an MOU, then you put some signatures down on the
Yeah.
page. That not draft, it can be done in concert with. Moving forward on any of the approvals, remember that both the entities, 3 boards, and then the one have to approve either way. So, we sort of agree that we're going to make some sort of an adjustment on a particular project where there's a blended rate. WPCA says, okay, great, we're gonna move it forward. It comes to, it's the RTM and they say, no, well, that doesn't work. So, we want to try to avoid those, but my point is that every single one of these projects, the dollar amounts and whatnot, they get approved by both. No one.
well,
can
they do, but
without
I
being
think an
involved.
umbrella MOU puts more force behind the policy.
Oh, yeah, why?
Versus just, and because, and project by project MOU, which we do anyways, it's not
That's a
really.
bond
Yeah,
consultants.
we do that with the bond. It's not like it takes a lot of time. It's just goes along with the bonding approval, and, maybe it takes a little time to just draft the document, but they're all pretty, they're all identical in terms of the wording. So I don't know whether that would go away, but I feel like, to Craig's point, that the broader MOU on this serves to make this policy.
Yeah.
It has,
'Cause it's
legal
legs.
force behind it
Yeah.
because we have, we're basically putting forth a funding mechanism between two separate tax assessing entities. So,
Yeah, we'll talk to Phil.
yeah, okay. So I'll add that to the,
Excellent, though. This is really
yeah,
fantastic.
very good, yeah.
Thorough. Very thorough.
The engineer in me. But definitely appreciate the encouragement about the flexibility and the feedback on that. I am in agreement with that for sure.
Yeah, and I think I'll see if I'll dig up the last one, but I remember focusing on it when I was reading our old policies on, I think on fund balance or something, that it was, I think the board was pretty smart when that was first drafted 10 or 15 years ago or whatever, to not make it so inflexible that it would cause us to have to do things that we didn't want to do. So, under certain circumstances.
So as we continue to walk through the different sections here, I'll just bring out the highlights. So in section 6, I think the highlight here is under the section on the impact on the WPCA. We talked earlier about a minimum threshold in the fund balance.
Yeah.
So I had included language under sustainability to speak to that. And again, this is something that I'm revisiting with WPCA's project manager. We have started benchmarking, but we definitely haven't completed benchmarking against other Connecticut WPCA's and what they utilize as a minimum threshold. I know that just a general average, as I had stated earlier, was like 15 to 20%. So we could go by percent of budget, or we could go by months as well. You know, we could go like 3 months, 6 months, a year. And I'm not certain, you know, what makes the best sense. I'm hoping that not only by benchmarking against other similar WPCA's, that this is something we'd further explore through the cost of service study. Yeah.
I like that we're just putting a minimum here. I know on the town side, we have a range. We have a floor and a ceiling, and I don't think you want to do that here. So I think this makes sense. And only because we're starting out with a higher amount than would, you know, if you put a floor and a ceiling, you would need to use up what you have right away. So, okay.
Moving into the funding procedures, and again, this is getting to the case-by-case evaluation before we even go seeking funding allocation. That this is something that we would submit to the WPCA Commission. This would be a brand new procedure for the most part. I would really formalize what hasn't been a formal process, is my understanding in the past. So this would require us to come to the commission, the WPCA Commission, with the project plan, which would include the budget and a cost benefit analysis. And I think the cost benefit analysis is something that has been missing in the past. We've made these proposals
Yeah,
in front of
it's
the
supposed to be in the infamous 14-point
Yeah.
thing, but it's never
Yeah.
been,
True.
yeah, it's never
That's
been well
my
done.
question.
Yeah.
Did we do this to the 14 points?
We should have, but yeah, we should have, but sometimes we get the 14 points. It really doesn't have financial impact. It's like, we have to do this, otherwise, you know,
Like
like
infrastructure.
something's gonna blow up, yeah.
And then reporting out too. And so I review the approval process here. And correct me if I have captured anything inaccurately in the approval process, only because I'm new to the process myself, being new to town, but this is my understanding of it.
Yeah.
And how it is supposed to work.
Yeah, if for bond financing, yes, and even for something through fund balance. Yeah, no, this is right.
Okay.
And I think it's good to have this memorialized, because in some cases, it's been a little loose, and some things would come to the boards before the commission had approved it,
I
and
saw that.
yeah.
Which had me asking the question.
Yeah, yeah, and that shouldn't be the case. It wasn't that the commission wasn't aware of the projects, but just the formal
sequence.
steps hadn't been taken. And again, I think our charter is not clear, so we just sort of informally followed other processes that, but didn't always follow them consistently, so.
And then when it comes to the reporting out as well, and I think that this is something that we have done inconsistently in the past, at least from what I've seen, is, regularly reporting out a financial summary to the commission and to other boards for these projects.
Yeah, no, and that's something, that's another thing we've all been beating the drum on, and I think the updated format of the town capital report facilitates that, because before it was, once you approved a project, you never knew what happened to
Yeah.
it.
See it
We've
again.
never
Yeah.
had ongoing reporting. And obviously when we, most times when we approve a project, it hasn't even gone out to bid yet. So there's always, there's differences in the bid amount versus what we do, much less how it gets executed. And there was
We have an
always a
example
lot
of
of
that
stuff,
right
so.
now is a significant discrepancy.
Yeah.
In our favor, at least, much less, about half of what went out with the bid package.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
it's good, but it also gives you an opportunity to say, why did
Why?
why did we get it wrong and what can we do better? Yeah.
Why? And then just ending with that this is, from what I know of other WPCA's, this is a policy or guidelines that are reviewed on an annual basis during the budget process. Makes sense.
All right, excellent. So the follow-up items, yeah, I would just encourage, just so that we know it, to think about the costs related to the plant, environmental remediation, the language about, you know, guidelines versus policy, and then the MOU question. Make sure I saw that in there. Yeah, okay. Any other questions on that? Ms. Ruggiero, do you have any questions? Okay,
No. No, I don't. Thank you.
excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you again for doing this. All right, so last item on our agenda is to hear, consider, is item 5, to hear, consider, and approve the draft minutes of December 2024 and January 9th, 2025. We have a motion to hear this item, Mr. Curley.
I'll
Second,
second.
Ruggiero. Any comments on the draft minutes?
No.
Okay, I have no comments, so all in favor of approving the draft minutes of December 5th, 24 and January 9, 2025, please raise your hand. Okay, the minutes are approved unanimously. So item 6, take a motion to adjourn. Mr. Curley, Ms. Ruggiero, all in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This was great.